And we'll give about 30 more seconds before we begin. All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Um, Welcome to our Large Language Models in Action webinar. I'm Eddie Kim. I'm Everlaw's AI evangelist. I pair over 15 years of experience in e-discovery and forensics. I have a passion for leveraging emerging technology to transform legal workflows. Also with me is my special guest, Dr. Megan Ma. She's a research fellow and assistant director of Stanford program in Law, Science, and Technology and the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, Codex. Her research focuses on the use and integration of generative AI in legal applications and the translation of legal knowledge to code, considering their implications in context of human-machine collaboration. She also teaches courses in computational law and insurance tech at the law school. Welcome, Megan.
Hi, Eddie. Great to be here.
Yeah, so we have a lot of things to talk about today, and let's just get started. So there's been so many things happening in the last few months, especially in the world of AI. But could you highlight the most significant changes in the generative AI landscape over the last 3 to 6 months?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're definitely right that there's been a lot of changes, but many of them sort of are grouped within a similar space. And what I mean by that is since GPT-4 was released about a year ago, there's been somewhat of a race across different foundation model companies to build better and better models. And what we're seeing here actually within the past few months is a rise in what they call GPT-4 class models. And I think what's interesting is that these models all have unique capabilities that surpass GPT-4 in some respects, but that in large part, GPT-4 still is seen as a standard. And so what's fascinating is that we haven't seen yet, and I think we might be near a particular model that we can say is past as GPT-4, but now it's become almost a brand. And what's the minimum requirement that's needed in a large language model? I think what's fascinating is not only the increased competition now. So Inflection AI, for example, came out with 2.5. We have Anthropic's Claude suite of tools. So they just released Haiku, which is their smaller model. So Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus came out. And then finally, we have Google's Gemini and Gemini 1.5. And I think they all have these distinct characteristics. Gemini in particular has a massive context window, although they've been in a little bit of a sticky situation in light of some news about their models being unable to produce, I guess, historically accurate images.
Oh no.
But I think, yeah. So like going back to the point, I think and of course, I think OpenAI itself came out with multimodal is sort of the big thing. And they came out with Sora, so kind of state of the art generative video now. And so we're seeing, again, like not only a standardization of what large language models should look like, but also multimodal is something that's almost integrated into all of these models and something that we're going to have normalized.
Yeah, I mean, I've recently read about how Gemini Ultra and Claude 3 Opus are like now considered as legitimate competitors to
Mhm.
GPT-4. And it's like we've never heard of that statement before until like recently. So it's kind of exciting to see that happening. I mean, do you feel like we're at this point where, there's a point where people couldn't run faster than like a 4-minute mile. And then
Mhm.
once someone was able to do that, everybody else started to run faster than that. And I'm wondering whether we're going to start seeing even more models, perhaps even smaller models or more open source models, being able to reach that threshold and even break it beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's as you rightfully pointed out, it's always a good thing when you introduce more competition. And I think as I was saying, I think each of these models, even though they're at what we call GPT-4 class, they each have their own sort of relative strengths. We're seeing, for example, with Claude Opus, that those models tend to be better at like reading tabular data. That's why you've seen very early on that Claude has integrated with, say, Google Sheets. On the other hand, kind of we've seen a rise in open source models, but also a sudden interest in these smaller models. And that really came from this emerging kind of open source call for large language models. But we've seen like what we call smaller language models, which is fewer parameters. And really how I kind of see the difference between large language models and small language models is large language models have obviously many more parameters than the smaller language models. And in practice, what that is the difference between, I think, a Swiss Army knife and, an oyster shucking knife. And why
Okay.
I use this analogy is like a Swiss Army knife, it gets the job done and it does a ton of other things, but you can probably get to a certain level of sophistication if you have a small language model that you really want to fine tune or get it to do a certain specific task. And I think that's what is a huge interest, I think, that's going to be emerging. For example, we see in 273 Ventures, they came out with K3LM, which is a legal large language model. And their idea is that it's a small language model, but it's tuned with a proprietary data set that is tailored for the law and also kind of fine-tuned on specific legal tasks. And I think that it's going to be really interesting almost seeing, you have incredibly sophisticated large language models capable of doing a whole suite of different tasks. But how does it actually measure up to a small model that, is meant only to do certain things? So again, like to me, I think it's yet to be determined kind of whether or not people decide in the end to choose the Swiss Army knife or, the oyster shucking knife.
Absolutely. So like, I mean, you just mentioned briefly about, small language models as well. And I think a lot of people in our industry, they tend to conflate or basically use Gen AI and large language models like interchangeably. Could you perhaps like point out the differences, and perhaps are there other technologies beyond large language models that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think generative AI, how I see it is it's the umbrella term, but it's primarily kind of used from the context that in this era, what we've been excited about is actually this idea of generation, again, generation or creation of content. And large language models, they come from a line of history that dates back to natural language processing, natural language understanding, and of course now natural language generation. So it's kind of multiple different types of tasks that it could handle. And so with large language models, I think again, the focus is largely on the consumption of text and then being able to do a number of tasks out of it. The latest being an additional layer of generation. But with kind of this push forward, typically large language models still are encompassing of text to video or text to speech. But we started to kind of shift in the terms of using something like foundation model, which is looking at the different modes that generative capabilities are now able to do. So it's not just text to text, but it's text to speech or text to video.
Awesome. I appreciate the nuances there. So, you've mentioned all these developments that are happening right now. How is it actually impacting, or can it impact, or how will it impact the legal industry?
So that's a great question. I think it's clear that in this particular era of generative AI, we've seen a sudden interest from lawyers on in technology. And I think it's funny because when we think about the professional rules of conduct and we think about it from the medical profession, they've always been tuned into new developments and new technological developments in particular. And it's because it's tied to their duty of competence. But for
Mhm.
lawyers, the same duty of competence actually doesn't entail staying abreast of new technologies. What it really entails is being able to master your own craft. And so learning kind of new technology could be a little bit of a hassle at times, right? Because it requires you to step out and take the time to do so. But I think for me, what really was fascinating for lawyers was, well, Microsoft had this partnership with OpenAI. So suddenly the tools that they are most comfortable and most familiar with have a natural integration with large language models with generative AI capabilities. And so the question really became, wow, yeah, I really do need to pay attention. And we're seeing, I guess, impact across the board now. We've started to see a lot in the first year, what I call the exploratory phase, where we've seen initial interest in legal research, of course, in e-discovery, and also in counter analytic abilities. What it is was almost a natural graduation of efforts, right? Legal research was already in the stage of being able to use natural language to query as opposed to Boolean. But now with, these large language models and these new capabilities, you're able to just basically articulate concepts almost, and it'll be able to like find them quite quickly. I think with e-discovery, it was because of, the natural processing of high volumes of information. It needed high volume, high velocity. And so obviously these tools are masters at that. But I think now as we're pushing forward into what I call like a little bit more maturity, there's obviously increased sensitivity around the risks that are involved in using these tools. I think it's no surprise that, there's been so many cases ongoing still of lawyers kind of misusing these tools, hallucinations coming up, and like false cases that have emerged. And I think in this time, there might be attention on using the tool for sort of broad sweeping tasks like, oh, draft this contract or draft this legal brief, but it might be integrated into sort of what I call the meta processes, right? Being able to better identify what exactly is human machine collaboration. What are the relative strengths of using these tools versus the relative strengths of preserving kind of the human component of it. And I think to that point, I think what we're really being asked to, as we understand the sophistication of these models, is what is it about the legal craft that I need to understand? What exactly is it that I do? And I think before we've never, as legal professionals, had to answer the question of this is what I'm hoping to achieve and what I actually can get out of the legal task and what is the quality of the legal task. We've never had actually metrics to define what is good legal work versus not.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these tools are kind of coming to head with confronting actually the profession's ability to conduct their own work. And so part of, to me, why we've sort of done a very shallow analysis of like, this is intern level work or this is associate level work that maybe these models can do. I think we're starting to ask the question, how well exactly can these models perform, and how well exactly do I perform in this particular task, and being able to compare that.
You're talking about this human and machine interaction, and the other day we were talking about like what are some recommendations that you could provide to lawyers who are reviewing content generated from large language models, and like why should they take the time to verify or validate the output, and what should they be looking for specifically on qualifying the content. And you were mentioning something about the this whole notion of attorneys starting off with this mindset of being like a QA like agent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think what I see is at the moment right now, the primary modes of interaction either come in the form of chatbots or co-pilots. But the issue to me is that actually in the existing analog process of legal work, chatbots and co-pilots are not really how legal professionals necessarily function. I think we frequently get questions from law firms that work with us. They say, like they really want to know if we should have like a chat bot. Well, it seems a little bit weird, and it takes you outside of your flow in, how you do your work to be like, oh, just casually query like a random chat bot. And I think, sometimes it touches upon what I call like the double-edged sword of the UX, where, we've gotten to a point where the technology itself is very, very accessible, but also the way that a chatbot is shaped, it almost acts like an oracle to an extent. So you're kind of thinking, or you're baited to think that it will give you the answer and it's the right answer. But actually, that's not really how legal work is done. And then the other side of it is this notion of a co-pilot. I think we don't actually conceptualize collaboration in the legal space as kind of a knowledge share. What really happens is we've historically bent towards our tools. So we've treated kind of legal collaboration almost as an assembly line. We like parcel out little tasks, especially with the existing like library systems. We're checking documents in and out constantly. And because of that, we've been like parceling them. This is junior associate, and then we hand it to a senior and on to a partner. So when we now kind of have to approach using these tools, we should be thinking about, I think, how exactly do we fundamentally change how we work with one another? And I think we can only have a use or maximize or optimize kind of uses of co-pilots if we actually have a co-pilot mindset. If not, kind of we don't really know when exactly we want to activate certain machine intelligence. And again, it goes back to like being able to better define what is the relative strength of the human lawyer's work versus the machine. And off the top of my head, like immediately, we've already known that scalability and accessibility are something that these tools are great at. So what, nuance can we get out of that? The other side of it is these models are great at providing alternative perspectives. They're also kind of creative. And so it's great at teasing sort of strategy out, right? Because it might offer you some counter arguments. So we're starting to see a little bit more, I think, sophistication in how we're using these tools. And that goes along with, how we should be conceptualizing a co-pilot.
Yeah, I'm actually very interested in the creativity aspect of leveraging large language models. Like in my past life, I was a computer forensics investigator, and one of the things I did often was like I tried to imagine various possible scenarios, right? And it was like interesting to see, oh, what if I could use like a chatbot to give me some more examples? Like, hey, if I were this type of person with this type of psychological behavior, and like I'm trying to accomplish this, like how would I go about doing this? It's like giving me extra ideas I wouldn't have been able to think about before. So I do see some advantages there. Now we've been talking about the potential impact based off of these recent developments. What are some of the impact that you've seen, or how the judicial systems have reacted to these developments?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. It's sort of, I think, both sides. Where, for example, one of our faculty, Professor David Enstrom and Margaret Hagan, who leads up the Legal Design Lab, they recently signed a partnership with the LA Superior Court to integrate generative AI into courts. On the other hand, we've seen, so clearly there's a sense of enthusiasm there. But I think on the other side, because of all of these cases that have emerged about lawyers that have misused ChatGPT, fed, like information that could have been, breaching confidentiality, or it's generated kind of false cases. There's also kind of a sudden, I think, emergence of a lot of questions around how we should be changing or shifting professional rules of conduct. And I think what we've seen, at least, is I was sitting on a task force that actually looked into some of our existing rules of professional conduct and determining, what are some principles that we need to ensure responsible use. And I think one of the conclusions that we got was actually the existing rules already accommodate for responsible use. It's about being specific about the application. And so some of the outcomes of that task force, we started to enumerate some examples of inconsistent and consistent behavior with the professional rules of conduct in using generative AI. And then from there, we saw the State Bar of California actually adopt these principles and release their own practical guidance. And then kind of going forward, we're starting to see like the Florida Bar, and we're starting to see, I think, New Jersey as well has released some guidance in this respect. So there's definitely like measured caution around their use. But I think what more research needs to be done is how exactly we describe quite tangibly what are specific types of responsible behaviors. I think that's where we need to better spell out. There's starting to be research that our center is doing with one of our fellows, and he also kind of has a startup around AI agents, but this is possibly a bit sci-fi for some, but we've trained essentially this idea of LLMs or, generative AI watching other generative AI. And so here we trained a model to understand all the professional rules of conduct and what are the parameters around responsible behavior versus not. And essentially we had a fictional kind of use case where, a law firm is using an SEC chatbot or something. And we essentially asked this agent to watch out for, behaviors of this chatbot. And anytime something seemed to be inconsistent with what is, the parameters of responsible use, it would flag it and then ask and then signal it to a human lawyer. And basically this is starting to bring this idea of we can have better human machine collaboration. We just need to brainstorm, what ways in which we can change this architecture today.
I really love the idea of like having AI agents like look at other AI agents, right? It's like this multi-agent system, and it kind of leads me to believe like because like document review is one of those things where we have a lot of human effort being put into it. They're reviewing documents one by one, and then if we replace that with AI agents who are doing the basically doing like the first pass review, and then now you have human reviewers who are basically doing the QC work, right? But what if we have another AI agent that's designated just to do QC work? At that point, what would the impact be? Would we elevate the work that attorneys can perform? So like rather than starting off doing QA type of work, now they're able to do more strategic, bigger picture type of stuff. What is the potential impact of these like additional AI agents working together, and there's less work for us to do?
Yeah. I mean, that's a fascinating question. I think there was a book that Richard Susskind had released. It was like about online dispute resolution and future of courts. And he has this thing where lawyers in law school are trained almost to think about the edge cases only. And he describes this as a symptom of like appellatitis or something like that. You're thinking in like appellate courts only. And I think it like translates across all types of legal work, that there's actually quite a bit of legal work that is rather repetitive and rather like described as the grunt work. And I'm sure all junior associates know that very well. And this idea is, if we are interested and excited about getting to the point of that strategic level work, we might start to see more and more of that as we kind of figure out ways in which to integrate machines into it. And I think sometimes people like to draw like hard lines, like this is, junior associate work and this is, senior associate work. But actually, I think it goes both ways in a sense. Like what we describe as grunt work, there's all these other meta processes and how they lead to edge cases. That type of work is going to be a little bit more sensitized, because you can have these machines process at high volumes everything that you've described as menial, but it might actually be able to signal all these other tinier cases that you may have personally as a junior missed as well. But these models are trained as seniors or partners and have a specific lens that the juniors don't have. And so we're seeing kind of a negotiation on all sides, like what actually is menial work or what is grunt work and what is strategic work. So I think to your point, we might actually be going towards that direction.
Okay, that's very interesting. And now, we're starting to talk about the future of work, so to speak, right? So like from your perspective, what does the future hold for generative AI in legal tech? It's a very broad question, so feel free to approach it however you feel.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of promise. And I think there's a lot of promise because we haven't had, what some people define as the empirical turn for lawyers. And as I was saying, like we're starting to approach a time where we can actually better understand the profession itself, what exactly is quality legal work. But also for long, like legal knowledge has been gatekept against like, licensing and things like that. And it has historically, disadvantaged a lot of people from getting access to legal help. And so I think these tools are also allowing for, pro bono teams, for example, to alleviate some of their workload. I think it's allowing for in-house counsel, for example, to better define what exactly I have to outsource to external law firms and what I actually can manage in-house. And so all of these things for the first time, we're able to better understand. And I think that's what really the promise is here, is that our tools are not only capable of handling some of our work, but also better able to tell us about ourselves and how we can be better lawyers. And I think that that is really not necessarily a trend of like what's new and what's coming. And I think obviously there's a lot of excitement in multimodal, for example, but mostly to me, what's most exciting about all of this is that we're seeing for the first time a bridging a gap between, not only law school to practice, but also, how do you ramp up lawyers quite quickly and just altogether bring up, the foundational level of our practice.
Very interesting. What about in terms of how we interact, whether it be with data or with information in general? Do you feel that lawyers in the future will be interacting with data differently from how we're interacting with them today?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of interest in what exactly is the next mode of interaction. We mentioned, chatbots and co-pilots. To me, I think there's going to be a discussion on what exactly is the hardware that's going to be used. Are we still kind of doing a lot of our work on our laptops, or are we able to do them with our smartphones? There's a lot of interesting research coming from Apple, for example, on how do you decrease latency, or how do you kind of make models efficient so that you can run your own model on your phone. And that could be really interesting because, one of the big questions around privacy right now and security is that these models have to be hosted by the foundation model companies. But with open source and with, distribution partnerships like with Mistral and Microsoft, you might just be able to create very, very local models that are run only on your own machines. And so you can protect against client information very well. And you have all of these generative AI capabilities. The other thing is, do you actually ever have to see all of the mechanics? Do I have to pull back, underneath the hood? So you mentioned data and things like that. I think we will always have that natural language interface. And I think that's what is succeeding. And I think many people are noticing that natural language is the programming language of today. So I think how we will be interacting with our documents, we're going to get used to pretty much a dynamic and interactive environment at all times. It wouldn't be a lot of, calling each other necessarily when from within the office. We might be able to find different spaces to be able to connect and collaborate in that sense.
Sounds like a great excuse to get a Apple Vision Pro. And we could just all talk to each other in the metaverse instead. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to start to ask you questions from our audience. Let's see what we got here. What skills should legal professionals develop to stay ahead in the age of AI?
Yeah, so I often get this question, and what I usually say is first we have to define exactly what are our core skills today as lawyers. If we ask ourselves what are sort of like the top 5 things that we do, I think we have to better enumerate those, and then kind of being able to have at least just a foundational knowledge of these tools. And to me, I think there isn't much to know beyond understanding that these models have statistical and probabilistic foundations. And what that means is if you're thinking about using these models for accuracy-based tasks, that's already kind of a starting point of a problem because these models can never offer you 100% accuracy. You can kind of use all these technical interventions to get it close, but it will never be 100% accurate or nor 100% reproducible. So I think that that's kind of one area that, think about.
Awesome. How do we get past client concerns regarding over-reliance on AI, especially with the risk of unchecked hallucinations?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. One thing I would say is um, what we frequently, I guess, recommend is a AI risk toolkit. And so there's a lot of tools right now, and I think what's emerged out is not just auditing per se, but there's like a whole suite of things to verify whether or not your model is actually performing the way it does. So, for example, why I always insist on lawyers understanding better their profession is there's something called Guardrails AI right now, which is almost like a layer which is able to formally help you define what types of outputs you want and expect. And that basically acts as almost a filter layer so that whatever input is going in, your outputs have a higher percent of guarantee. And so you can only kind of have that level of effectiveness if you know what you need out of it. I think the other tool that I often think about is LLM observability. So we have Arise, for example. They have an open source library called Phoenix. And what it is that once you have these tools out in production and you're using them day to day, it can monitor all the moments in which these outputs do stray from what you wanted them to do. And then kind of unpack, like what was this moment? And then take a look at some of the prompts, maybe like in the intermediary steps. So I think if you showcase to your client that all of these measures, or at least some of these measures, are in place, or if you wanted to add a security layer, that you have a red teaming team now to kind of evaluate what are those vulnerabilities. All of these kind of demonstrate to the client that you've thought seriously about the use of the tool and why you're using it.
Great. Okay, last question. It's actually two questions that are very similar to one another, so I'm going to conflate them too. So where do we start? And what is the best way to test if a Gen AI tool actually works?
Yeah, so I think where to start is, I always say, just open up any one of these tools and start experimenting away. We were having a chat earlier, but I even asked my mom to kind of test out these tools, and she uses them in kind of fun ways. For example, she'll take pictures of fridges and ask, GPT-4 Vision what she can make for dinner. And sometimes it gets it wrong, so it mixes Asian sauces together that don't go well. But as I said, it really just starts with you opening the tool, and they're largely kind of available on web browsers, so you can even just do early experiments there. And I think to the second question of how do you know whether or not the output is whether or not it's working? Well, the outputs, I think we forget sometimes that we are our own experts. And so as kind of lawyers and legal experts, I think the outputs that are generated, that's where you can kind of verify, is it actually doing the task that I expected? And how do you iterate on it?
Awesome. That was a great story. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this webinar. Special thank you to Dr. Ma for sharing her insights. And if you'd like to see more of her, you can visit her at Stanford on April 11th at the Codex Future Law 2024 conference. I think we have information there. And yeah, I think that's it. It's a wrap. Thank you so much for everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.